Welcome to the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield, your gateway to understanding today's geopolitical landscape. With 50 years of experience across 10 countries, Henry shares expert insights on world affairs, offering practical solutions and engaging guest perspectives. Dive into the Greenfield Report for lively discussions on the issues that matter.
This is Henry R. Greenfield for the Greenfield Report. Today we are going to discuss the so-called three-legged stool of the Trump administration and its economic policy, its architects of this policy, its manifestations of this policy, the goals of this policy, and its progress today, and what happens if one of those legs fails. Will the stool actually fall, and with it the economy of the U.S. and much of the world? But first of all, let's take a short ride back on Trump's old 747, as he calls it, to the Middle East, and specifically the Gulf, where he is attempting to move the center of globalism away from China and away from Asia and definitely away from Europe, and any focus there, which we will touch on later, with his appalling treatment of Ukraine. Needless to say, there is no focus, zero, on the so-called global South for Trump, other than as a surrogate deal with the Saudi family to infiltrate that area and seek to lessen their progress. That leaves the Middle East and the sheikhs in the richest region of the world. It needs to be said over and over, the Gulf states of Saudi, Qatar, and the Emirates are collectively the richest places on earth. And Trump, with his pro-oil policies, literally wants to make them, and of course himself, much, much richer. You will see how important those oil sheikhs are to the Trumpian revolution and how that stool could not stand without them. While this is not a direct part of the three pillars, suffices to say, it supports the entire structure, as without endless amounts of foreign, untraceable, and corrupt money, and the oil that goes with it, the three pillars will not work. Could you call this a fourth pillar? Well, let's define the first three before we go any further with that premise or that thought. First, it's important to note these are not my designation. The three-legged stool, in fact, is Scott Besant's, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He uses them all the time to describe, and this is in air quotes now, the plan. Let's use air quotes on that one and on Trump plan for economics. To outsiders, Trump's plan appears to be haphazard, a mixture of attacking a government he runs, along with providing tax cuts and massive unsustainable deficits, and of course debt, which we have discussed in previous episodes of the Greenfield Report. Part of the 40-year legacy since Ronald Reagan's effort by conservatives to downsize, if not destroy, certain parts of the government, and to make it loyal to Trump and end the so-called independence, or in Trumpian terms, the deep state. But this is ultimately not about the budget or even the debt or the deficit or even the deep state. You may recall that we provided a simple, straightforward, and step-by-step outline of how easily to balance the budget, begin to pay down on the mountainous U.S. debt, which has now ballooned to over $37 trillion, and most of all, not to cut services, or Medicare, or specifically Medicaid, or Social Security. Others have noted in a piecemeal approach some of our recommendations. No one has tackled this in such a comprehensive way as we have. And you may ask why. Why did we pack so much into that single episode? Because a piecemeal approach will not work. Because people like Trump will take it apart, people on the right will actually mock it, and in the end, nothing ever happens. So we did the full Monty, as you might say, in order to be able to put a comprehensive solution, which so far, in terms of all the viewers that we've had, thousands and thousands of listeners, no one has been able to attack our recommendations. The very worst thing that anybody said was, well, those are great ideas, but we're not sure that they're going to happen. But that's not the point. The point was we developed a comprehensive solution, which the Democrats could use, but of course they do not. So let's go back for a moment and start looking at what is really going on with Trump. Cutting things like a bit here, like he's doing on some pharmaceutical prices and medical costs for some drugs, or a bit there, like trimming some of the bloated agencies in Washington, D.C., or even looking at cutting old or outmoded expensive military programs, it simply won't work. Why is that? Because we've got something big in the background that we also discussed in that episode of the Greenfield report. Because the interest on the debt alone is now the third largest item. And that means it's more than the military spending, and just short of Social Security, and just short of the combined Medicare and Medicaid. Or let's just put the number out there, $1.8 trillion, now approaching $2 trillion every year and growing. So you just cannot actually just have a balanced budget. You actually have to cut the budget in order to start paying down on the deficit. You also have to control a few other areas, such as interest rates, which we will discuss, because those interest rates are obviously driving this entire thing. And it's no longer the case as in Trump just before COVID, or just as he was getting into COVID, when he drove those interest rates to zero. And everyone could say, well, the federal government can just keep borrowing because it doesn't really cost them anything. Well, now with interest rates in the 6 and 7%, and even the Federal Reserve is talking about not lowering that because of Trump's what? His tariffs and his erratic behavior. Because of all of that, Trump has a major problem on the interest rates. And it's not just on any other thing for you buying a house or a car. It is actually holding up the entire national debt. It's the same principle, folks, that you would have. The U.S. clearly needs some kind of, let's reduce weight, such as a GLP drug or Ozempic or a diet to stop this unsustainable madness. So what is Trump's solution? On the surface, it looks like he will make it worse. He knows that is not a good idea by just carrying on with the three big items of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and of course, the military. So he starts by saying, well, I'm going to raise your taxes with tariffs, which is the first leg of the three-legged stool. WTF might be your reply. He knows they are taxes. Everyone does. But he needed the fiction of saying everyone else will pay for it. And guess what? He's not completely wrong. That's the thing about Trump. When he says something, he's not completely wrong. Tariffs are about two things. First of all, they're revenue for Trump, as he is desperate for revenues, as he's also cutting taxes. In other words, he needs a substitute. He's got to find some money somewhere. Otherwise, this entire thing will collapse. His claims are preposterous, of course, on the tariffs and the revenues. And of course, if he reshores enough offshore manufacturing, for instance, he will lose those tariff revenues as that becomes onshore. But he wins by weakening China, or so he thinks, which again, he is not completely wrong, as China is an export, not a consumer-driven country. China does get disproportionately hurt if the little girls do not get those proverbial $30 and only get $3 that Trump talks about. But actually, for a moment, substitute in the names Temu and Shein instant fashion, which is already getting crippled, as in 1 in 3 garments in the entire world is manufactured in China, and most of that is in southern China, where I lived for many years. That's not good for China or its workers, where there is virtually zero social safety net compared to what the Chinese, this is now quite ironic, is saying that the U.S. is a socialist model of taking care of everyone, which of course is even larger in Europe or Australia, but in China, no way. So there is method in the madness. However, Trump is making a lot of mercurial decisions, and he doesn't care for details. So he's all over the place and is hardly making any money on the tariffs, as they are on again, off again. I mean, even today he did the pause again for Europe till July. So that 50%, which yesterday was going to kill the trade with Europe, is now off again. So far, it has been a complete failure, tariffs that is, and damaged the U.S. dollar along the way, and of course, the bond market, which Scott Besant has constantly been barking in Trump's ear, telling him, you can't do this, you can't do that. And Besant, even though he may be a hedge fund guy from the George Soros era, Besant understands that the bond market cannot wobble too much, or again, this entire thing would collapse. U.S. exports are now down by 20%. Nothing can be done to change the economy. However, Trump wants to, from services, which is 70% of the U.S. economy, back to manufacturing overnight. And he knows this. And really, in the end, he doesn't care. That's the thing you need to know about Trump. With all three of these little legs on his stool, he doesn't really care about all the collateral damage that's going on around. He just uses that in order to keep people on side and to make sure that things don't get too far out of control. Because of this part of the plan, the tariffs obviously are just a means to an end. He knows, for instance, that his numbers of increasing U.S. Steel, which he talked about just the other day, from 14,000 employees to 70,000 employees, is complete nonsense. And Nippon, which is going to be the new collaboration partner, will just modernize and keep a few bits, and it is over. He knows that 90% of the so-called factory jobs, if any, that were going to be coming back, will be to operate the robots in what are called dark factories, so-called as there are no lights. There's no people, so no lights. No reason to have those lights on. Robots are not afraid of the dark. So let's look at stool leg number 2, getting those companies to reinvest in America and bring that money back. It's at this point that we need to remember, and this is quite important for our listeners, that Joe Biden beat China on all-important FDI, or foreign direct investment, every year in his 4-year presidency. By the way, Biden is the first to have even had a single year of beating China in, forever, or at least 4 decades. Well, how did Biden do that? He did it the old-fashioned way, which was government investment, the so-called much reviled picking winners and losers, and Biden chose AI. He chose high-speed chips, bringing that back for the first time in forever, with $60 billion U.S. as an example, from TSMC to bring it back from those high-end chips from China to Arizona, the red state where I live. Thanks, Joe. Tens of thousands of jobs, and you were rewarded by the Arizona voters by voting against your protege, Kamala Harris. Ditto for solar, where I discussed this with the Georgia Trump campaign manager about Biden investments into Georgia, and he called me a liar. When I had him put into his Chinese iPhone, solar, Georgia, Biden, up pot Joe Biden, who created the solar industry, it said, creating tens of thousands of jobs. Before you ask, I am sure you figured that one out. They voted also against Kamala Harris. There too, by the way, even in the communities with the jobs that Biden gave to them. And they also, by the way, gave Biden the credit, but they said, hey, they just couldn't vote for a black Indian woman. Sorry about that. And the Democrats, the Georgia cracker, and he was a cracker, although we were speaking in Hungary of all places at the time, said the only agenda that the Democrats had was identity politics. So the Democrats are not offering alternative, folks. Just thought I'd throw that in there. They're just being angry against Trump and his three-legged stool. So for Trump, it's not about jobs. It's about one thing. It's about always just one thing. It's about the money. Fancy that, just about the money. Let's say Trump is correct, however, and brings back FDI from other countries that eventually exceeds Biden, which cost Biden nothing, by the way, and Biden left, by every economist's calculations, including Republicans, a solid, well-performing economy. The old kind of economy, the old model before Trump decided to blow up the ship and say the U.S. is not a services economy anymore, and he promised to go back to the 1950s, with, of course, no way there, as there are no supply chains, and what there is goes back and forth across borders, like with Canada, and thus the whole anti-globalization runs smack into the globalization created by Republicans for Republican owners of all the major corporations of the United States, which, by the way, we will deal with in the next episode of the Greenfield report. That is the entire supply chain discussion. Trump gets that FDI and also from Apple, who now says that they are going to invest $500 billion. Sounds pretty impressive, huh? Well, that's the same $500 billion they promised to Biden. After, by the way, again, Apple, have been investing, now get this, $55 billion US dollars on average in China for over 20 years, which I detailed in my Quora comment yesterday, in which I played a small part in, but was unable to, of course, reverse. 20 years. Think about that. 20 years. Well over $1.2 trillion that Apple has invested in China. And not only that, Apple has also trained 28 million people in China and paved the way for their competitors. They've also helped to create the EV, that's right, electric vehicle revolution, and contributed millions of scientists and engineers to the Chinese military. Those Silicon Valley guys just doing their best for the U.S., right? And mankind to the tune of a company valuation of $2 trillion. Happy Wall Street, happy 401k, but not so happy Trump. So Trump was going to put on that 25% tariff back onto Apple because they said they were going to go to India. But I'm sorry, we're digressing here. Leg number 2 of the Trump stool, he gets his money in, but he is also bashing all corporations to accept lower margins. Just like we saw last week, as we just mentioned, he's expecting everybody to absorb those tariffs. The corporations absorb the tariffs. Or he puts those tariff whacks on people like Apple if they wanted to go to India. And he's like, as he put it, India doesn't need more jobs. But can those corporations really absorb those tariffs? Well, that sounds okay. But what about the retailers who, by the way, they cannot just switch manufacturers as they by and large do not manufacture. They just buy and sell stuff. You know, that 70% of the U.S. economy known as the consumer economy that we have lived with growing and growing and growing for the last 40 years. Well, was Trump stumped with that? No way. He has a plan, and he brought out the big guns, and it is called, and this is his ultimate reason and his ultimate goal, tax cuts. The third leg, and this is the one that it is all about, and let's look at that wobbly leg for just a moment. I watched Speaker Johnson yesterday on TV explain how fair and supportive he's being to cut SNAP benefits and Medicaid to maybe 10 million or maybe more, as it is only for those able-bodied males, and you are just going to have to step in and pull on an oar, as he put it, if you want anything, and stop taking from anyone else. Jake the Sap Tapper, as always, just let him talk, and Johnson left with a few million more on his side, as he is always doing the right thing, and he's helping the people by screwing the people. And the Democrats, not a peep. And certainly nothing like we put in the episode on that exact subject on the Greenfield report. They just have anger. But that anger is not going to work, folks. But then again, we digress again, as the Democrats don't have a clue. Not even Bernie, and certainly no one else, who are more worried about some illegal immigrant from Maryland and what happened to him and what the heck is happening to everybody else down there in that El Salvador prison. But what about the 150 million people that are going to be affected under the Trump tax cuts? And of course, the rest of the world, like Ukraine, which can go under as no one is looking at them or helping them at all. How quickly they all forget those heady days when Biden led a coalition around the world to box in China, to keep the Gulf states under control, and support Ukraine, while overseeing even Assad falling in Syria, while pulling the U.S. out of Trump's debacle in Afghanistan, which of course Hegseth is now going to look into to see who he can pin that on. How about the architect of the exit, his boss, Donald J. Trump? But again, we digress. So many moving parts with Trump. It is at this point we need to mention the Gulf states, not the Middle East, as Trump avoided Bibi Netanyahu and Israel like the plague that Bibi Netanyahu has become, and flew over Israel into the waiting arms of the Saudi family, who conveniently have a country named after them. Trump clearly wants the world, and this is important for everybody to understand, to move the center of gravity of this planet to where the money is, and there is no bigger pot of endless money than in the Gulf. This is why it is important to the three-legged stool, because Trump wants and needs cheap oil, and Prince MBS has opened the spigots, which he did not do with Biden, which was just fine with Biden. With it, Trump can keep down gas prices. He can flood the world with cheap oil to placate all of the losses everyone will have with his tariffs on trying to get products into the United States. He and Vance and other MAGAs have openly attacked and derided Germany and the EU for having, as they call it, self-inflicted damages, focusing on climate change too much, when Europe produces little oil other than expensive North Sea crude, which is useless for the natural gas, as I call them, gluttons all over Europe. Yes, I know Biden solved that one too, by being the drill guy and sending LNG, which is converted to natural gas, to Europe to save them from Putin, who got cut off on Nord Stream 1 and 2. But Trump doesn't care. That's not in the plan. Now he has the money. He has shifted the world to the Gulf. He gets a free $400 million 747, which he gets to personally keep after and when he retires. Nice little gift, huh? He now has a new 10 square mile data center to mine crypto. The plan is clearly working. If he has to say, good going, guy, and good luck to a former jihadist from Syria to keep his own benefactor, Qatar, you know, the free 747 guys, no worries. It's all, as Caroline Levitt would say, in a day's work. So what could go wrong, and what is the benefit of the tax cuts besides the rich getting richer? Because Trump will get some of those corporations to eat some of those tariffs, because he is giving them a massive tax cut, personal and corporate, and he has already gotten rid of 31% of the IRS auditors in the Doge massacre, so they can do whatever the hell you want, boys. And trust me, it is a white boys network that Trump is dealing with. Last time they stuffed most of their tax cuts into their pockets with buyouts, and it took literally almost until the last 2 months before the pandemic started for Trump to show any results at all for his tax cuts. And then, of course, it all collapsed during the pandemic because it was a house of cards. This time, he is working his planning and is planning his work, and they are investments. Say what you want about Trump, but Trump not only has a plan, he is twisting every arm so that he can make it work for him, for his family, of course, and those 92 deals around the world, for corporations, and for the U.S. military, and, of course, your garden variety rich person who will pay less, while the middle, working, and poor will carry it all with more and more consumption taxes. Yes, those tariffs and other sales taxes. Watch out, because a GST or a VAT is coming, as Trump will need that money, as in pay now on imports or pay later when it is made in the USA. As what is a VAT? A value-added tax, just like in Europe, which of course Trump attacks, threatening, that 50% tariff. And then again, as we said, nope, he took it off and he'll wait till July to tackle it. No worries, he got the news cycle focused on him for a moment, while the tax cut bill, which is what he really should call it, goes through the Senate. All the while, the media machine keeps feeding Trump and his acolytes with specials on attack the government, which was Fareed Zakaria today, or attack on the poor, or end of the way of life, or Washington in crisis, when all it is, folks, is what it has always been, the mega rich wanting to get mega richer. They don't mind if you eat your nachos and go to the game and watch UFC while Trump is, waving around, or any of that fake wrestling. That is your Roman Coliseum, and throw stuff if you want while you're at it, and gamble more and more, as why not? Kristi Noem wants to run a Hunger Games competition among illegal immigrants on who can make it to become a citizen, and I think it will be pretty darn popular. Trust me, they will definitely get a few of those MS-13s in there with sympathetic stories about, who will kill for that one. Hey, the ratings will be wild, as Trump would say. But then Trump's one big, beautiful bill is now what we are in consideration. It will have passed, and with it, into history. More trillions will move back and forth to the Gulf states. Crypto will soon be a de facto currency, and eventually a national currency or a global currency alongside the US dollar. China will still be a problem with all those Apple-trained engineers moving them into AI, but India will not, as Trump will get the American consumers to pay Apples and others to get back to the USA. Trump will invest nothing in the U.S., not at least from the U.S. government side, other than his golden dome, and it will be all left to graft and waste and abuse and fraud going on in the U.S. military, which will now be over $1 trillion a year. They will focus on finding their one or two cheaters in the system, or probably blame it on transgenders to justify cuts to benefits, just like Reagan did with the infamous welfare moms in the 1980s. The MAGAs will eat it up, even though they are the losers, and they will pay more. Yachts will get bigger. The rich will definitely get richer. Wealth will be transferred to the red states that are now low tax, and the blue states will get poorer, which is the plan, as they are drained of people. Of course, drained of universities, which Trump is attacking, and on their all that research, and their cities hollowed out until they become compliant. Trump has a plan. The three-legged stool is more solid than you think. This time, he has the Gulf states in the form of unlimited oil and money to back him, and he doesn't need a lot more than that. Why do you think Scott Besant is smiling so much? It's all happening, folks. Now, if he can only keep Trump from being not too crazy on the tariffs, it will work perfectly, and he and Trump especially can, as Trump plans to become the first president who is a trillionaire. Forget that billion stuff. We're talking trillionaire. Just pipping, as the Brits would say, Elon Musk at the $1 trillion finish line. And that old Joe Biden, hey, don't you know he had dementia and he was cognitively impaired, and the news cycle keeps going on and on. Oh, and sorry, he died of stage 4 metastatic cancer. But his son, Hunter Biden, by God, he got a lot of money, and Joe was impaired, and he didn't sign his pardon, so we need another investigation into that. Soon the sun will never set on Trump's three-legged stool. He will stand tall on it, and Besant will be smiling. Musk will be back smiling as he fixes Tesla, and they will change enough rules so that Musk can keep selling his EVs, and of course he will keep out China. Pollution and temperatures will rise. Some coal-fired plants will reopen. Robots will run the factories. Crypto will be the name of the game. And then football, then basketball, maybe even hockey, and good old baseball will all be there along for you to play along with and to follow and to bet on, with all of the blood sports to keep America happy again, all of the Roman Colosseum. This is Henry R. Greenfield for the Greenfield Report on Donald Trump's three-legged stool, what it means to you, and why it probably will not collapse, and it will make him the richest man in the world.
Thank you for joining us on the Greenfield Report with Henry R. Greenfield. We hope today's insights into the ever-shifting geopolitical landscape have sparked your curiosity and broadened your perspective. Stay connected with us for more in-depth discussions and expert solutions. Until next time, keep exploring the world beyond the headlines.